Hello, my name is Petroff and I'm Grandmaster from Bulgaria. Today we're going to continue with our course on the opening theory, and we're going to finish with the moves e4, 5. So far we have studied few gambits, and then we studied the Italian game, and today we're going to see quickly the other possible lines for white. So let's start with the move knight c3. This is not maybe the most popular line, which is with knight f3. The idea behind the move knight c3 could be that in case of knight c6, let's say, or knight f6. Now, of course, again, white can play bishop c4 and knight f3, but the difference with the other lines is that if they play now, for instance, f4, it can transpose to some kind of king's gambit, but with moves included knight c3 and knight c6. The other idea here, apart from f4, is to play g3. White are putting the bishop on g2. Let's say black play bishop knight f6, bishop g2, and now black have various options for these bishops. It can go to c5, most likely to b4, and also they can go g6, bishop g7, but let's say they go bishop c5. And now usually this knight here is not going on f3 because it will close the bishop, but it goes to e2. And then the idea is, let's say, after d6, okay, castle, that white wants to play this idea with f4. But first they have to, that's why there is, sometimes they want to play, in case, let's say, black plays castle, white can play knight a4 to exchange this. So usually, before castling, black making the move a6. Okay, this is waste of time, but it allows them to keep this bishop on this diagonal. After knight a4, you can just go back bishop a7. And now, usually white can play d3 or h3. And then again, black have many different ideas. They can castle both, or they can usually play h6 to avoid sometimes this idea with bishop g5, knight d5. So now, in order to play f4, since this is not possible to remove the bishop, we can play bishop e3 with white. But after bishop e3, black can just take on e3, and then when you take with the pawn on e3, you cannot play f4 anymore. Of course, okay, this pawn will control the d4 square, it will open the f file, but in general it doesn't bring much to white. So if you want to move f4, you have to bring the king somewhere. But if you play immediately the king to h1, black can play knight g4, attacking on f2. So when you push the pawn, they can play knight f2, check. So that's why you have to play the move h3, first to cover this square from the knights, and then, in case of castling, now you can go with the king to h2 to defend this pawn, and then you can finally play this f4 idea. And the game here is very complicated. Black can play many moves, knight d4, b5, bishop e6, different ideas. Let's say knight d4, and now finally white wants to play, in most cases, f5, then they exchange one of the knights, and they try to push g4, and if they can, h4, and g5, and try to launch an attack on the black king. This is one of the possible deviations. So for white, black are trying here, on the second move, but you have to know what how to deal with the move f4 here. It will be some kind of strange king's gambit. White have this move e5, and now it's a disadvantage that you have played knight f6 because you have to go back, which means that you lost two moves. That's why after f4 you should either defend with d6, but even better you can play, if you remember, this was counter gambit. In the king's gambit, when you play e4, e5, f4, there was a move d5. And here, these moves are included knight c3 and knight f6. So let's say if white takes here, it can actually transpose to exactly this game which I showed you from Paul Morphy. After d3, bishop b4 was followed, and bishop d2, e3. It was a very exciting game. But here, the difference is that in the other line, without the knights, if the knights are still on b1 and g8, if you remember, if you take on e5, usually was met by queen h4 check. But here we don't have queen h4, so black have to take on e4. And now there are many moves for white. They can play knight f3, to stop queen h4 and then to prepare d3 or d4, but also they can play immediately this line pawn to d3, which looks like a blunder because, okay, what if queen h4 check? So now isn't black just winning? If king e2, of course, queen f2 is going to be checkmate only after 6 moves, which is great. So that's why g3. Now knight takes, and it looks like it's finished for white. If they take on g3, we can take the rook if we want, or maybe we can take even on g3, and then after king e2, bishop g4 check, many wins. But now they have this typical escape when there is such a pin with the queen and knight on g3, or respectively on h5 and g6. They are playing the move knight f3, attacking the queen. So now if you take the rook or the bishop, white just takes the queen, so it means that we have to go back with the queen to h5. This is the only square. h6 there is a bishop, and if you go back, you just lose the knight after pawn takes. So queen h5 has to somehow keep this pin on the rook. So now black are hoping that rook g1 will follow, so then they can take on f1. But now white have this move pawn takes, and after queen takes, this is a very complicated line. Or even here, instead of taking on g3, actually after knight f3, queen h5, white can also take on d5, which is a little bit stronger than taking on g3. Now knight takes d5, attacking on c7, and also white can just play knight f4, attacking the queen. So then that's why black have to take the rook. Now knight c7, king d8, and white also take the rook. So this is very king is in the center. The white king is in the center, but still he can eventually castle. But they miss the rook on h1. So now it's very difficult to predict what will happen. But it looks like it is better for white, because the knight on h1 looks like he is a trap. And for black it will be more difficult to catch the knight on a8. So usually here black are playing bishop g4. And now bishop g2 immediately attacking the knight. There is some kind of escape for black, because now if you take on h1, black can just take on e5 with the knight. And then it's very difficult to defend here this knight. Then the bishop is rook e8 check eventually. So here usually white is trying the move d4 in order to defend the pawn on e5. They want to take on h1. So in order to prevent this, black have to take on f3. So now the idea is if bishop takes, queen h4 check, and then suddenly the white king is in trouble. So you have to take with the queen. Now queen h4 check, white can just play king f1. So that's why usually after this exchange, knight takes d4. Here black are hoping to escape. For example, if white play bishop e4 to defend on c2, black can play bishop c5. And now the position is looks like maybe black can escape eventually, because both knights are in trouble. But after king d7, if black managed to take on a8, they are fine. That's why here I think it's a bit better for white to play bishop g5 check. Now the idea behind this is that after king c8, if the king is closing the knight, now we are not playing bishop takes h1, because we will lose the rook, and no bishop e4 again, because this is a waste of time, but we have this move, castle, immediate. So now the point is that knight f3 is not possible, because rook d8 is a very beautiful checkmate in the endgame, which means that now both knights are in trouble. So we are attacking both knights and we're going to win one of them. Most likely black have to defend this knight on c5 with bishop c5. Eventually they can win the knight back. But now we have a very clever move, which is the move b4. And then we're attacking the bishop. In case of bishop b4, rook takes d4 is winning. The only choice is knight e6, attacking the other bishop. But now you can, white can just simply take the bishop. And after this move, now even c6 is an option, but rook d7 is very simple win. and with the idea now rook takes b7, and we see how strong is this bishop on h1. Now it's winning for white because there are so many threats with the rook here. c67 is coming many threats. So this is very interesting line, but you have to be clever here, and after d3 to know that this is a bit risky. So usually you can just play knight takes c3, and here black have many moves. They can play knight c6 or pawn to d4, and usually it's considered that let's say after d4, knight f3, knight 6, the position is around equal, but there is a long game, it's complicated, and both sides they have their chances. So usually, yeah, we have seen over this Vienna opening with the move knight c3. These are the two options, knight c6 and knight f6. Of course, there are some other setups for black, but in general, this is the ideas here. Usually, white wants to play g3. Also, the other possible deviations, which is very important to know, is if you play knight f6, okay, after f4, d5, but after g3, black can also play d5, not only bishop c5, knight c6, like we have seen in the previous setup, but with the move d5, this setup is a little bit different and a bit more active for black. Now white has to take with the pawn, knight takes. And of course, like I said, in this kind of positions, when your opponent has a knight on d5 or d4 respectively, and it's always a mistake if you take knight d5 or if you will black knight d4, because this will move the black queen in this example in the center, attacking the rook, and the queen in the center is very strong here or here if there are no knights which can tackle her. So when this knight is exchanged, we cannot play the other knight to c3 immediately, so the queen is very annoying. So that's why white have to play bishop g2, and now usually black taken on c3, because if they try to keep this knight in the center, let's say by playing bishop e6, and now white can play knight f3, attacking this pawn, and after knight c6, let's say castle, white have these ideas sometimes to play rook e1 to attack this pawn. Also d4 is very strong, they can open the center, so black have to be very careful. So that's why usually it's not worth for black to try to do this. And they take here after bishop g2 on c3. Now if white takes with the d pawn, of course black will exchange the queens, and the endgame is even better for black, because when you double the pawns here, it will be 4 pawns against 3, which means that this is like an extra pawn for black on e5. So white should take with this pawn, so eventually they can hope that they can play d4 or even d3, at least they will have these 3 pawns in the center, which are keeping each other. And now black have many setups. They can bring the knight to c6, they can put the pawn to c6 and knight d7, knight f6, bishop d6, bishop e7, bishop c5. Okay, let's say knight c6. Now in this setup also white can play either knight f3, either knight f2. Exactly here it's better to play knight f3, and okay, let's say bishop d6 or bishop c5 is also possible. Now castle. This is one of the typical positions in this line. So now white have 2 possibilities to play rook e1 or d3. There is a plan to put the pawn to d3, bishop e3. This knight goes to d2, and then he can go to c4 or to e4. Also there is idea knight g5, knight e4. The knight g5 is also releasing the f-pawn for white, and for black there are many ideas. You can play bishop g4 or bishop e6 or rook e8. Many ideas. There is one interesting line in which white are playing d4, and now the usual move is bishop g4, but black have to be careful, because now after h3, if you exchange on f3, it will give the white the pair of bishops. But if you go to h5, you have to be careful also for such a lines like g4. Now bishop g6, for example, and now knight takes e5. And in case of knight takes and bishop takes, sometimes there are some lines with f4, f5. So this is something for black to worry. So I think we can conclude this opening Vienna and move to the other openings with the move knight f3. And now, after knight c6, we can turn our attention to the move d4, so-called Scotch game. Okay, again the idea is very simple, like I told you, just to tackle this pawn on e5 and make move, so we can release potentially after this the pawn to e4. After pawn takes, we can continue with this kind of gambits. We can play move like c3, or we can play move like bishop c4 and castle, and then we can play something like c3. But most of the time here, white are taking the pawn with the knight. And like I told you here, it will be not a good idea for black to take knight takes, queen takes, because again this queen from d4 is very strong, hitting on g7, so you cannot move the bishop. You cannot move the rook because it will hit here. You cannot play d5. So black have to play very cautious here. And now there are different lines which are possible. The most common are knight f6 and bishop c5. But also there is a strange line which is the move queen h4, which is a very curious line, queen h4. Usually probably you know that it's not good to move your queen early in the opening, because, okay, let's say you move the queen and you attack something, but if your opponent defends this thing which you are attacking, after this he can try to attack your queen, and she has to move again somewhere back and then back again. In most cases you lose many tempos. In these positions there is some kind of logic in this move, because it attacks this pawn here. So now actually white have to know what to do, because if you just take the knight here, after queen e4, you are losing a pawn without any compensation. If you play of course g3, again queen e4 check, you are losing material. So it's not so simple to defend this pawn. Bishop d3 is not possible because you lose the knight. And if you try knight c3, again black can continue this policy of attacking your pawn with the move bishop b4. So many players, beginners, which don't know what is going on, they start to panic here, how to defend this pawn, and they start to play some strange move with the queen. But actually here the line goes that you have to sacrifice this pawn, but then you have a very big compensation. For instance, now you have to play the move knight d5. It was also possible on the previous move, by the way, instead knight c3. And in case of queen takes here, you can play bishop e3 or bishop e2. And then you have a very good compensation, because in order to defend this, most of the times black have to play the king, which is not very good. So already your king is in the center. If you play this move, for example, castle, now I'm attacking the queen, and if you take here, take with the knight, okay, you have extra pawn, but your king is in the center. So when you retreat somewhere with the queen, then just white have a very big advantage in the development. They can play bishop f4, bishop f3, bring the rooks in the center, jump with the knight. And in general, they have to develop these pieces here, and their king is always in danger. So this line is not so popular with queen h4. Only sometimes people play it for surprise, but in general this is not so great line. So we can move to the lines knight f6. This is the most natural move, developing the knight and attacking the pawn. So now again white have two options. They can defend the pawn with the knight, or they can take this knight. In case of knight c3, usually again black are continuing their hunt for this pawn, so they're playing the move bishop b4. So now white have some problems again how to defend this pawn. So if you play this opening with white, you have to be prepared very well, because if you are not, you're going to have some problems with this pawn. Now you have to take on c6, there is no other way. And now again black have a choice. If they take with the d pawn, then white can exchange the queens and go into this endgame, which I told you that usually this is better for the side who has 4 pawns here against 3, because the other 4 pawns, when they are doubled, are very easily blocked by the 3 pawns here. That's why black have to take with the pawn. So now we have to defend this pawn with the bishop. Bishop d3, developing the bishop, and then we want to castle. And here black can play many moves, but it's good for black actually if they can exchange this pawn for the c pawn, because if they play d5, which is the most logical move, attacking this pawn, so now in case of castle, for instance, black can take first on c3, and then they take on e4 and they're winning a pawn, which means that white should push this pawn forward or take on d5. But if they play e5, this is not a very clever move, I think, because now after knight g4 and then, okay, let's say castle, white are having problems again to defend this pawn, and if you play f4, after this all the time black will have this bishop c5 ideas, so it will be hard to castle. That's why here usually white take on d5, and for black it's good to take with the pawn, because finally the pawns are not doubled. And now usually white are castling. They can give queen e2 check, for instance, which after queen e7 can lead to an endgame. Bishop b5 will be met by bishop d7 check, so this is not so dangerous. So that's why they castle. And here for black is the question what to do. Is it good to take the knight, or is it better to castle? In general, this is better to castle, because if you take this knight, okay, you are doubling the pawns. Now you have to castle, but now actually this bishop becomes very strong, because it can go to g5, it can go to a3 also. Even if it just simply goes to e3 and then d4, again it will be a very, very strong bishop, because it will be very difficult for black to push him away. So it's better to keep the black bishop and castle here, if you're playing with black. And now usually white are playing this move bishop g5. So now there is idea to take this pawn in case of some random move. Let's say if you play rook b8 or push some pawn, white have this idea to take bishop takes f6. If you take with the queen, knight d5. If you take with the pawn, still knight d5. Okay, I'll just demonstrate you, okay, you know, if you play some not so clever move, what will happen. Bishop takes, and now knight d5. So now this is a very typical combination. If you take with the queen, suddenly this bishop is leaving with check, and the queen says hello to the other queen, and thank you and goodbye. So the game is over. So that's why here you have to be careful, and after bishop g5 to play pawn to c6 to defend the pawn to d5. And then there are different lines. Usually they go queen f3, attacking this knight. So now black can play bishop e6, bishop e7, h6, many moves. And the game is very complicated again. What are the plans? Okay, like I said, this is not very good for black to take. For white, sometimes they take on f6, and after queen takes, they go into this endgame. Black can prevent it with bishop e7, of course. And now usually you have to play the rook somewhere. You have to be careful not to play rook d1. Sorry, not queen d1, but rook d1. Because then it will be this bishop g4 and you're going to lose the rook. So you have to play first this rook to e1, because this is an open file, and it's always good to put the rook to the open file. And then, okay, black can play many moves, let's say bishop e6. And now usually you're moving somewhere this knight. This knight has two options. It can go to e2 and then try to go to f4 or to d4 to attack this bishop, or go to f5. Or he can go to a4 and then with the moves b3 and c4, let's say, you can try to challenge these pawns in the center. And there are two main lines. Also you can play h3. It will be a useful move. Usually black are playing moves like rook b8, attacking this pawn. And after b3, for example, queen a5 can follow. And in the game is very complicated. It's around equal position. So this is one of the main lines in the Scottish. And the other line is here. Like I said, here white can take on c6. So now again, taking with this pawn is not an option. You have to take with the other one. And now e5 is a move which is attacking the knight. Knight e4 is not a very good move, because then white can attack your knight with the queen d4, let's say, or bishop d3, or queen f3, so it's better to go with the knight on d5, or to play the move queen e7, which is very popular nowadays. The idea behind queen e7 is that white have to play queen e2, because f4, black can just play d6. So after queen e2, then you're moving the knight on d5, and after c4, which can happen also in the other case, now black have this move bishop a6, pinning the pawn, so for the moment it's not needed for this knight to retreat. And now there are various continuations for white. They can play queen e4, pawn to b3, and then bishop b2, pawn to g3 and bishop g2, knight d2, many moves, and this is very complicated position in general. So this is one of the options, and here the other option after knight d4 is to play bishop c5 immediately. Also a possible line, and with the idea is that you meet, okay, if they play bishop e3, of course you have to be very careful now and not to play knight f6. You have to play queen f6. If you play knight f6 or knight e7, now white is just winning after this very typical combination, just taking the knight, attacking the queen, and then when you take, I take the bishop, and game over. If you play d6, it's not also very wise. Okay, this defends the bishop, but after knight takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, this endgame will be terrible with these triple pawns here. Also big advantage for white. So you have to go after bishop e3, queen f6. The point is that now you can meet knight c6 just with bishop e3, and your queen is not attacked like it was in the other case. That's why white have to defend now the knight. They have actually only moved because knight c3 is losing the knight, so they have to play pawn to c3. And again, this is a very complicated line. Now you can go queen g6, or you can go knight e7, or bishop b6, or d6, many lines. Let's say after, for example, knight e7, white can play bishop c4, which is the most active move. Bishop e2 is a bit more passive. Now, okay, there are many moves, but let's say castle is a normal line, castle. And now, in this position, for example, black have to be careful about not to play d6, because after knight takes, again they have these double pawns, and here after f4, white have advantage, because mainly of these double pawns, so they have to avoid this and play, maybe it's better for them to play here bishop b6, because now if knight takes, you can just take with the queen if you want. And now for white it's not so simple to develop this knight from b1, so that's why usually they go knight a3, and after d6 they can go knight b5 or knight c2, but in general this is again very complicated position, but both sides have their chances. And I think these are the most of the lines with Scotch. Okay, let's see what else we can see. After bishop c5, also the other line was, instead of bishop e3, of course, white can just go back knight d3. If they go knight f5, this is a very also important thing, because now this knight is attacking on g7. So if you play, of course, king f8, it's very passive, bishop f8 is mistake, g6 it's exposing a little bit, so you have to find here the move d5, and this is a little bit more complicated. So now in case of knight takes, king f8, attacking the knight, and then, okay, white have to retreat somewhere, or if they take on d5, you can take on g7. So it's very complicated line, but in general this is good for black. But you have to know that you meet knight f5 with d5. And the else is if they take on c6. And now here you have to find again very interesting move. Taking with the d pawn, of course, is not so good. You can take with this pawn, but the best move is queen f6. So this knight will not escape, and to take on f2 here with a checkmate. So knight d4 is not possible. Knight b4, knight d5. Bishop e3, also you just take bishop takes e3 and double in the pawn. f3 is not a good move because then this bishop is very strong and the white king cannot castle. So white are forced to move the queen. They can play queen f3 or queen d2. And in this lane, very often the things are going very quickly into the endgame. Let's say with queen f3, queen f3. Now you can take on f3, you can take with the queen to c6, with this pawn you can take, with the other pawn. Both moves are more or less equally strong. You can also take on f3 to double these pawns, and then take with the d pawn or with the b pawn. And this endgame is also around equal. Of course, it's a very long game, but in general, this is not very dangerous line, I think, for black. So that's the things in the Scottish. So now we are moving to another opening, which is not so common. In this position, after knight f3, knight c6. Okay, you can play knight c3, and after knight f6, this was very popular opening in the past. And now with bishop c4, you can go into some kind of Italian, which we have seen that it's not so dangerous for black. And now they, with the years, they have decided that these lines with bishop c4 maybe are not so dangerous. So in general, they decided that it's a good idea maybe to bring the bishop to b5. So this is possible in this position to play bishop b5. This is something like Ruy Lopez. We're going to see Ruy Lopez in a while, or Spanish game. But here the moves knight c3 are included, and knight f6. Sometimes it can transpose. And now black have many moves. They can play pawn to d6, knight d4. They can play bishop d6, bishop c5, bishop b4. So there are many lines. In general, the game is very complicated, like I said. Here there was one very popular line in the past, bishop b4, and after castle, now, for example, bishop takes here, pawn takes, now d6 looks like a reasonable move, and now, okay, if you play d4, they can play bishop d7. So now let's say rook e1, defending the pawn, castle. So now if you take on c6, bishop takes, and then it's attacking on e4. And yeah, this is a very long line. This is something which is possible. So this line after knight c3, knight c6, usually the game continues like this. With the move g3, you can transpose to the Vienna opening after d5 or bishop c5 also, but with a knight on f3. So still it can be transposed to Italian, to Ruy Lopez, to Vienna. But also there is another interesting deviation here, which is the move c3, or so-called Ponziani opening. Again, this is with the same idea. You're playing c3 with the idea d4, which we have seen in the Italian game after bishop c5, bishop c4. We have played this move c3. But when the bishop is not on c5, this is considered that this is not so dangerous opening for white, because black can meet d4 with many good moves. So here black have many options. They can play knight f6, or they can play even pawn to d5, or they can just play d6 and g6 if they want to be more solid. In general, okay, let's see knight f6, and now we have to follow our idea after c3 to play d4. Now the point is that, okay, if black takes here, white wants to play e5, and then if this knight goes somewhere on e4 or d5, take with the pawn on d4 and hoping for have the advantage, because they have better center, although it's not so clear if they have advantage, but this is the point. So sometimes black are taken on e4 with the knight, and now bishop d3 will be met by d5, and if you take on e5, maybe black can play bishop c5. So now the line which goes with the move d5, and by the way, this is giving a black a chance to play very interesting line with the move bishop c5, again some kind of gambit, this time for black, in which we are sacrificing the knight on c6, but then you can take with the bishop on f2, or with the knight on f2, and the line is very, very complicated. I'm not sure what's going on in the end of the line, even with the engines. But safer is to play knight e7 if you're playing with black, and don't want to study so many long lines. Knight e7, and now after knight e5, usually they go knight g6. So they want to exchange the knights, and the position is okay, a bit symmetrical. After knight takes g6, pawn takes, white can play bishop d3, and in general the game is equal, but black have to be careful now where to go with the knight, because knight d6 I think is not so good move, although it's been played many times, but then it's more difficult to release bishop. And knight c5, also sometimes when they remove the bishop back to c2 or e2, after pawn to b4, this knight have to go to a6, which is not so good, so maybe knight f6 is the best line. And now let's say white can castle, or they can play c4, and this is a possible line here for black. So now they can play bishop e7, and okay, even they can take the pawn, but this is a bit dangerous after bishop g6. In general, this is not such a bad opening for surprise, Ponziani, because usually black cannot prepare very well, but if black knows what to do, it's not so dangerous. And now let's go to the opening, which is called, not after me, but it's called Petroff defense, knight f3, knight f6. So black are not playing knight c6. Instead they attack this pawn. So now what to do with white? If you play knight c3, after knight c6 it will transpose to the other line we have seen just now. If you defend the pawn, it will be a bit passive if you play move stack d3 or defend it with the bishop or the queen. So the most active continuations, you can try to play d4 immediately, or you can take the pawn. Now, if you take the pawn, black have to be careful, because if they take the pawn on e4, which is a normal move, now suddenly white have this very good option, queen e2, with the idea, if this knight retreats somewhere back, sorry, not f6, pawn f6, knight f6, so now we can just play knight c6, and then we're trapping this queen, because queen e7, knight e7. So also if black play d5 here, white can play pawn to d3, and again here, okay, black can play queen e7, but in general white have here the advantage. They can play, for instance, knight f7, and they have better position. So that's why after knight e5, black have to play first the move d6. And now here white can retreat on f3, which is the most common move, but also sometimes they go knight c4, was tried a few times, but still nowadays the most natural move is knight f3. And now you take on e4, so now the idea is that you can move queen e2, but then black can defend with the move queen e7, and d3 is just nothing. Black can just go back, knight f6, and this is completely equal position. I don't have any advantage here. So that's why if you want to play for advantage, you have to play some other moves. Also after knight e4, so now the main move is d4, although in the last few years actually, white have turned their attention to the move knight c3. Also there was a period in which they were trying the move bishop d3. So the idea was if they go knight c5, then to retreat with the bishop, but actually the retreating with the bishop allowing to be played d4 with the tempo. So they are different things, but the most common is the move d4. And now usually black wants to keep this knight on e4, so that's why they are playing the move d5. There are some players who are not shy from going back with the knight to f6, but it's a little bit more passive. Okay, not immediately, but let's say after bishop e7, bishop d3, you can retreat with the knight to f6. But then white have small advantage because they have more space, in order that they have this pawn on d4 and your pawn is on d6, so they can play c4, knight c3. So that's why d5 I think is the best move for black. And now here there are many possible lines. Usually white are playing the move bishop d3, because bishop e2 is a bit more passive and it will not challenge this knight on e4. So if you're playing with white, in general, you want to get rid of this knight on e4, otherwise you cannot play for the advantage. So bishop d3 is an option. Now black can play either bishop d6, either the move knight c6. Both moves are possible. Okay, let's go through this move knight c6. This is a bit more ambitious, because sometimes black have the idea to play bishop g4 and to attack this pawn. So now white have to castle. And now black can play bishop g4, which is one of the lines. Bishop g4, pinning the knight. And now there are few possible moves for white. It would be a mistake to take with the bishop on e4, because after pawn takes, this knight is in trouble. So you should either play c3, defend the pawn, either be more ambitious and sacrifice the pawn. This move was played by Garry Kasparov a lot of times in the past. And tackle this pawn, and together with her, this knight. And then the idea is rook e1. So this is more complicated line. But this was developed lately in the years. Okay, this is not in the beginning of the chess, but this opening was played a little bit later. In case of c3, just to admit that black have this interesting plan with f5, and this is very king setup for black. So they can play after this bishop e7 or bishop d6, castle, and launch some attack with rook f6 or queen f6, and then with this bishop on d6, when bishop on g4, knight e4, they have a very good attacking options. So here, yeah, the other possible line was knight c3, like I told you. Usually now black have to take, although some people go back with the knight to f6. And now, I told you in general this is not a good idea to take with this pawn, but there is such a line where this pawn takes. Now there are various moves for black, many ideas, knight c6, knight d7, bishop e6, bishop e7. In general, usually white are putting this bishop on e3 on f4, and then this knight goes to d4. So in case of knight c6, very often, okay, let's say bishop here, we have seen some positions in which after knight d4, in order to prevent some kind of pins, black can just take on d4, and then this pawn actually is going back to the center. But most of the time this is just exchanging more pieces, and the position is very symmetrical. White have small advantage because they have a little bit more space, but this opening is very difficult to be broken in general. Also, there is one interesting line which I wanted to show you. This is for the move d4. So now black have two options: to take on d4, and then usually white play e5, and after knight e4, okay, the idea is that queen d4 is met by d5 now, and the black knight will escape after pawn takes. Just knight takes d6, and black are fine, more or less. So the other line is to take on e4, and now pawn takes e5. Again, black can just play d5, so that's why it's good to play bishop d3 with a tempo. But now d5 can be played. And now if you take with this pawn, black can just play maybe even, okay, bishop c5 or knight c6. Most of the time you take with the knight. And now there is one very interesting line with the move knight d7. Okay, black don't play knight c6 because they don't want to double their pawns, but they're hoping that they can now exchange the knights. If you castle or if you play something else, they want to exchange the knights and reduce the pressure in the center. And now there was one very interesting line in the past, which was with the move knight f7. It was looking very dangerous for black, because the idea was, if you take the knight, queen h5 check, and then after g6, queen d5. So then black will lose the knight. But after king e7, so here after knight f7, king takes, queen h5 looks very strong, but now after king d7, it turns out that queen d5 actually losing, because if you take, and this will give them extra piece for 2 pawns, and okay, white has some kind of compensation, but maybe it's not enough. Actually, queen e2, which is pinning the knight back, and since now the threat is pawn to f3, black are more or less forced to go back with the king to f7, because they don't have any other good moves. And after king f7, queen h5, the game will end into a draw, like it happened many times. But also one very crazy line, when in this position after knight f7, black can play queen e7. So this is now is very complicated. There are many threats for both sides. So first of all, now black wants to take the knight, and also they want to play knight c3 or knight g3. So then they're attacking the queen or with the rook. But the line goes like this: knight takes the rook, knight c3 check, attacking the queen, king d2, and now black attacking the queen. So what's going on here? Let's see. Black are without, but white are without one queen. But from the other side, white can take the knight on d1 if they want. But the strongest move here is rook e1, attacking the queen. So now it will be queen against rook, and if we can take the queen back for the rook, it will be even. But now let's see what will happen with the knights. So now the black knight wants to escape, so it goes to f2. So now if we go rook takes e7, bishop takes e7, okay, bishop h7 is possible, but it's fine for black. So now white is trying the move bishop h7, with the idea bishop g6 check, and now it looks like knight e4 is winning for black, because if you retreat or take with the bishop, you're losing. But suddenly now there is this combination rook takes e4, and after pawn takes, bishop g6, king d8, knight f7, and now this is perpetual draw. After king e8, knight d6 or knight e5 or knight g5, and knight f7, white can make a draw, because after queen f7, bishop f7, again this position is with extra pawn for white, so it's not so good for black to sacrifice the queen back. So this is more or less for the Petroff opening. And the final opening, before we study in the next chapter Ruy Lopez, is here after knight f3, Philidor defense, which is with the move d6. By the way, what will happen if they defend this pawn with f pawn? What's wrong with this move? First of all, this move is very bad because it takes the square of the knight. Secondly, it opens this diagonal, so you can simply play bishop c4. And thirdly, this allows even white to make this combination with the move knight takes c5 immediately. So now, okay, if you go queen e7, I can go back with the knight, and it will be not exactly like Petroff defense, because your knight is still on g8, and if you take here, then white have this move, queen h5 check. Now g6 is losing the rook on h8, but king e7 is even worse actually, because then after queen e5 check, black will be soon checkmated after bishop c4. So that's why f6 is not a very good idea. And we have seen knight f6, we have seen knight c6. So now we're going to see the move d6, which is the Philidor defense. Philidor was also one of the strongest players in the past, in the beginning of the chess, and he invented this defense. So actually his idea was to prepare this move d6. Sometimes he wanted to play immediately pawn to f5. So there were lines in which after d4 he was playing immediately this move to f5. But then later it turns out that this move is very risky. So nowadays nobody is playing this move. And here nowadays, after d4, you have to either take on d4, either defend the pawn, but it's better to defend with the knight from d7. Knight c6 gives white many options to play bishop b5 or pawn to d5. Okay, now it's a matter of choice what to do, because some people want to keep their pawn on e5 and keep this structure. So if you just defend the pawn, in case of exchange, d takes, it will be some kind of symmetrical position. If you take on d4, this will give white some chance to improve their center when they take with the knight. So they have this pawn on e4 against pawn on d6, which is a bit more active for white, and they have more space. Now, some people play here knight f6. And now I do this move to go to some kind of Petroff opening again. And in case white defend with the knight, usually now we go into the typical Philidor position with the move knight d7. Also, there's one very famous trap after knight d7. And now, let's say bishop c4. Sometimes here, black don't know what. They're afraid that white can take on e5 and then play queen d5. So they're playing the move c6. And after takes, they take with the knight. But now knight takes, and it will lose because white have bishop f7 now. So this is one of the possible traps. The other possible trap for black is when they play knight d7 and meet bishop c4. Okay, they're afraid that knight f6 will be met by knight g5, of course, and then they cannot defend on f7 very easy, so they go bishop e7, also very common mistake. And after pawn takes, now it turns out that pawn takes is met actually by queen d5. So now knight h6 is not possible because bishop takes, and now there is no defense on f7. And if you take with the knight, okay, you are defended against bishop f7 in that case, because you're defending the queen. But now there is this move, queen h5, attacking these two pawns, and now black are losing one pawn. So this is also a mistake here. So after knight d7, black should be very careful. So that's why here they're playing the move knight f6 usually, if they want to keep this pawn, in order to white to include this move knight c3. And now after knight d7 already, if you want to keep this pawn, bishop c4, you can already develop with the bishop e7. And now most of the time white making castle, and then after castle we have this very typical position for Philidor, in which black have many ideas. They can play pawn to c6, and then they have this idea to play b5, so usually white to go in a4. Also black can play a6 and then b6 and bishop b7 and pawn to c6, and they want to prepare b5, and white wants to play rook e1 usually. a4 is a typical move, h3, let's say something like this, usually in this position. After castle, rook e1 is one of the main lines. Pawn to c6, let's say. Now a4, because a4 is very typical move for this position, because you have to stop b5. And then again, there are many moves. a5 is possible for black. So now white can play h3 or bishop e3 or bishop a2. And this is very complicated line. There was one line which I wanted to show you. So now here there is very interesting looking move in this position. Bishop takes f7. This is something which you have to know with both parties. It looks a bit strange, but the idea is that, okay, obviously black have to take. Now knight g5 check. So now what to do with black? If you go back king e8, then suddenly knight e6 is winning the queen. If you go king here, also you lose the queen. Which means that you have to go either forward, which is a bit risky, or go to g8, which is the best move. Okay, so now black have extra piece. So what was the point of knight g5? 96. Now the queen has to move. And now knight c7. So it turns out that actually white are going to win the rook. So this move maybe was not so stupid to sacrifice the bishop. And now black have two possible lines. They can go queen g6, which is more sharp, with the idea to take queen g2 and then create some counterplay. And they can play also queen d8, with the idea after knight takes the rook. So this queen is controlling the squares here, and it can go to a5, and then eventually with b6, bishop b7, to win the knight back. So it will be, okay, white have sacrificed one bishop here and one knight, but they took two pawns and one rook, and maybe they can take on b6, so it will be more or less equal, a very unbalanced position. This line is more interesting, queen g6. So now the point is that, okay, white can just castle. In this case, black can move the rook, so it will be then real sacrifice of the piece, which is a very unclear position. But if they take the rook, which was happening most of the time, now queen takes here, and now rook f1. So let's see what's going on here. See one example from early of the 20th century. So queen g2, rook f1, and now the point is that it looks like it's very difficult for these pieces to come out to help for the attack, but after pawn takes d4, attacking the knight, and let's say queen takes, knight e5 is coming on, and now the threat is knight f3 check, obviously, and if you play the queen back, black can just play bishop h3 attacking the rook. So white have to play more or less f4, and they're hoping actually for knight f3 check, because then rook takes, and after queen takes, there is this check in the end, queen c4 check, very annoying. Okay, let's see. Rook takes, queen c4 check, and then queen c8 check, and it looks like white is winning. So black have to find other moves. They can play here immediately bishop h3, or they can play knight g4, which was played in this game. Knight fg4, by the way, very important, not the other knight, because if you play this knight, again queen c4 check, and you lose the bishop, but this knight, now bishop h4 is coming, and then queen f1 is checkmate after queen e1. So white have to play here queen d5 check. So the point is that if you play now the king to f8, now white is taking this knight with a check, and again white is winning. So in these games you have to be very precise, because you see one move makes a big difference. One mistake, you lose, or you win otherwise. So here, after this check, you have to go knight f7. So now the threat is bishop h4 check. That's why white have to play queen c4 in order to defend the rook and also attack the bishop. So now after bishop h4 check, here, now it comes very strong move, bishop e6. So again the point is that queen e6 is met by queen f1, followed by bishop and checkmate, so you have to retreat. But now knight f2 check. So now you're having again problems, because king e1, obviously I can go somewhere with the knight and take something. And you have to play rook f2, was played in this game. Now bishop takes, and after f5, it was played knight e5. So here white resigned, because if they take the bishop, it can happen here queen g1, followed by queen g5 check. Okay, actually it's not so simple. It looks like it's winning completely for black. Maybe queen h1 check. No, actually, yes, queen g1 is the win. And after king d2, bishop e1 check. So now if you go back with the king, bishop c3, if you take the bishop, then knight f3 is winning. So Here you see that this line bishop f7 is interesting, but it's not so clear, and very rare white play this line. It's considered to be good for black in general. So that's why here usually the game continues with castle, like we've seen, castle, castle, and this is typical Philidor opening line. Okay, so we are done with today's chapter. We have seen many different openings. In general, I have shown you this time only basic ideas. Didn't show you examples with the games. Just wanted to know you what are the main ideas behind the moves in basic. And next time we're going to speak more detailed about another opening. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Thank you and goodbye.